and welcome to Fraudible, the video podcast that combines academics and practitioners and to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the truth behind fraud, specifically looking at truth default theory, and I am delighted to be joined by Professor Tim Levine and practitioner Becky Holmes. Thank you guys for joining me today. Becky, I wonder if you would mind introducing yourself, please.
Yeah, so haven't been called a practitioner before. That's an interesting one. So I have written a book, which by the time this podcast comes out, will be out on the shelves. It's called Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. And it covers all things romance fraud. It's based on a Twitter account that I run where I out romance fraudsters in amusing ways, hopefully. But the book is kind of funny, but it looks at the very dark side of romance fraud, what happens behind the scenes, stories of victims, the psychology behind it, and what we're doing as a society. Well, actually, I should say what we're not doing as a society. That's me in a nutshell, a very large nutshell. That seemed to take quite a long time.
Thank you, Becky, and the same to you, Tim, please.
I'm Tim Levine. I too am an author of a book, kind of behind me here. I can't get my finger right. Is my book, which is Duped, Truth Default Theory and the Social Science of Lying and Deception. And I'm the author of Truth Default Theory. I'm representing the academics today. I'm a distinguished professor and chair of communication studies at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And I've been studying deception for a long time, 30 plus years.
Excellent, thank you. So Tim, let me ask you then, what is truth default theory to you?
So truth default theory is an academic theory of human communication. Mm-hmm. And the basic premise is that the honesty is the default mode of communication. So people are, when they're communicating, people are honest unless they have a reason to deceive. Mm-hmm. And people tend to believe others unless they have something that triggers them and makes them skeptical. So most communication by most people is basically honest. Not necessarily accurate, because people believe all kinds of crazy things. But from their perspective, most people are honest. And people do lie and deceive, but that's a relatively small proportion. And people just tend to believe the possibility of deception doesn't come to mind unless there's something that brings it to mind. And this is really, really, really important for us humans, because there's no point in listening to a video podcast if it just might all be, there's nothing to learn. You know, I'm a professor. There's no point of students paying tuition at my institution if the information they're getting isn't good. Economics doesn't work without at least some degree of trust. We can't have relationships without some degree of trust. So humans, being social species, need to communicate with other humans. To do this requires a certain degree of functionality. So the idea is that it has to be this way. Honesty and truth have to be the default. The other thing about truth default theory is it rejects what goes on in so much of the academic deception literature and everyday folk understandings of deception. It rejects the idea that cues are diagnostic, that you can detect lies based on things like hand fidgeting or arousal things or a lack of eye contact or any number of other verbal or nonverbal cues. Mm-hmm. Instead, if you want to understand the truth, you need to listen to what I would call communication content. That is what people are saying, and you need to understand it in the context in which it's said. So maybe that's more of an answer than you were looking for.
It was brilliant. Thank you very much, Becky. How does truth default theory link to the book that you've just published?
So I interviewed Tim while I was writing the book because I'd come across truth default theory and I bought his book and it was far too clever for me, so I just spoke to him. And I remember when we spoke and he said, you know, most people are basically honest. And I remember thinking, no, they're not. But then when I actually thought about it, and this is something I've included in the book, I thought, well, if you say to somebody, oh, what's the weather like? And they say, oh, it's not great. You don't think, you liar. Or, you know, if someone says, can I get you a coffee? It's no problem. You don't think, what? There's 90% of things we do take at face value. And actually, it really, really got me thinking about it, because as much as I would consider myself to be quite a cynical person, particularly having written a book and really sort of spoken to some sort of horrible, revolting people, 90% of my day is still believing people. You know, I got into a taxi the other day and the guy said, oh, there's a diversion there, we're just going to pop round. I didn't question it. I didn't question it when, you know, a waitress told me that they didn't have any oat milk earlier. You know, I just don't, you don't question things. So it was really, really interesting. And that sort of 1 hour conversation with Tim really shaped a lot of what I think. And it was incredibly interesting. And I think it's so many people, when it comes to romance fraud, they say, oh God, that person was so stupid to have, you know, to have believed them, or, you know, what on earth were they thinking? That's not true. How would they know? And particularly if people are speaking online and they're speaking on message, there aren't any of those signs, those physical signs, which we assume means somebody's lying. So, you know, if somebody's touching their face a lot, we always think, oh, they're not very honest. If something's happening by message, we don't guess any of that. So it's always stuck with me, what Tim said. It was an eye-opener for me.
Thank you very much. So, Tim, is there a truth default theory that can be applied to the written word as opposed to being in the presence of someone that you're communicating with?
Ooh, good question. I wish I'd asked that.
Get your own podcast, Becky.
The theory is a theory of human communication. And so it applies whether we are speaking face-to-face, on video chat, in text messages, in smoke signals, in telegraphs, in ship flags, whenever in sign language, whenever humans are communicating, the truth default applies. At least the theory applies across species to all modes of within species to all modes of communication. And it might even have to be that way. This is going out on a limb. I probably wouldn't claim this in an academic argument, but any social species. Can you imagine a beehive where the bees didn't trust other bees, or where the ants didn't trust other ants? Nothing that requires social coordination could work very well. You know, if you go to the restaurant and you ask, do you have oat milk, and they say no, and you say, well, let me check your freezer, how are you ever going to get through the menu?
Yeah.
If people don't believe me about honesty, I challenge the listeners, viewers, to keep a deception diary for a while and chart how much you communicate and how much of it's honest. And you're going to find, most of you will find that the vast majority of your communication is honest. And a few of you will find that you're what we call outliers and you lie way more than the rest of us.
I don't think that we realise until we actually sit down and think about it, we don't realise how many questions and how many assumptions we make every single day. So, last night I said to my other half, do you fancy curry? And he went, oh, no, let's have a Chinese. And something small as that. Imagine if I'd said, you're lying, you do fancy a curry and you're just trying to upset me. Tiny little things like that. Or, Claire sent the invitation for this, saying it's going to be a podcast. If I'd said, no, it's not, Claire, what are you doing? It's amazing how many tiny things we do every day which rely on trusting somebody else to the tiniest degree.
So then how does that link to the people that you speak to on Twitter, Becky? Because these people who claim to be your perfect man will obviously be of the hope that you're going to believe everything that they say.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, I think, with romance fraud, because what they're doing essentially is they send out, blanket invitations for people to talk. It's not just one person messaging one other person. There's thousands of them messaging thousands of people. And it's that hope that somebody, whoever it might be, they don't care who it is, will think, there's someone who wants to talk, and they will trust that it's a real person who they say they are at the end of the line. And that's all it takes. It just takes for that one person to reply, and they're in. And then I guess the truth default theory kind of becomes, it's sort of cyclical in that initially they've believed that it's a person, then the perpetrator can carry on making these claims, and the victim can carry on believing them. And the more of the relationship they make, the more they are likely to believe them. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think with the romance fraudsters, obviously they are going out to lie. It's not that they're building a relationship with somebody and they're telling a few cheeky porkies, no, your bum doesn't look big, and that kind of thing. They are going out there to lie. So they're putting 100% of their effort into saying whatever it takes to make somebody believe them. So, of course, the victim is automatically on the back foot with it.
So the fraudster is also using the truth default theory themselves, because they're of the belief that the person that they're talking to is also going to believe that they are who they say they are, and that they're going to hand over money, photos, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Tim would be you'd be able to talk more on that than me, but I'm guessing they would sort of, the fraudster would think, well, somebody's going to believe that I'm being truthful, because that's what we are as humans. We are truthful to one another. And then it carries on. So, yeah, I think absolutely that the fraudsters are starting off with the belief that somebody will believe them.
Yeah, this is a little beyond my expertise, but I suspect that there's at least two approaches to fraud. One might be kind of the phishing attempts that we all get on text messages. I don't know about you all. I haven't been getting so much recently, but I went through a while where I was getting 2 or 3 a day.
Yeah.
With a suspicious link. And to my knowledge, I never fell for one. And I suspect most people never do. But what they do is they send out huge, huge, huge numbers. And it only takes a small proportion. So the people might be right about phishing text messages 99.9% of the time. And it still can be a profitable technique because you can just send out. But I think with the what I would call identity-based fraud, where people are pretending to be somebody they're not. You send out a bunch, you get somebody to bite, but then you gradually build up trust and develop a relationship. So it's a much more long-term, I think, kind of fraud than so I think frauds can be quick hitting, right? You try to get the money and run fast and disappear before people ever figure it out. Or there's this other kind, which I suspect is much less common, where you put a lot of investment into building up this false persona, and you do it over time.
Interestingly, I think romance fraud is a strange combination, because initially it's phishing. They send out thousands of likes on dating sites or hellos on social media sites. And then once somebody has bitten, that's when it becomes a long game. So they have it's kind of the worst of both worlds, really, when they're the romance fraudsters.
Yeah. In the last episode of Fraudible, we had Dr. Liz Carter and Gareth Dothie speaking about coercive behaviours in fraud, and romance fraud obviously formed a part of that. And Liz was talking about how, like, the language that the fraudster uses, it very quickly sort of turns to we and us, and this is our life, for our journey, our future. Is that something that you've seen, Becky, in your research for the book?
Absolutely. So I think people do it in their real life relationships as well. When you first start seeing somebody, you are two separate entities. As you get closer, you start talking about, where are we going to go on holiday and what are we going to do here? And it's a really, really important part of showing that you are a couple. And of course, just because you're not together in real life, hate people who do that, I've just done it. Just because you're not together in real life doesn't mean that it doesn't work as well. So you think you're in a relationship with somebody, albeit online. When they start referring to you as we, you can be sure in your heart that you are part of a couple, you're a unit, you're strong. And it makes you feel like a team. And therefore you rely on that person even more because you're a partnership. So when the conversation about money comes up, which of course it inevitably will do, it's your joint money. And if you're, if everything else in your life is joint, if everything else is described as we or ours, then your money would be as well. So it doesn't seem like so much of a hardship to be sharing it or giving it away as it actually turns out to be.
So is there a point then, Tim, because obviously there's going to be a stage in the romance fraud and cases where either by their own realization or because of an intervention, that they come to the realization that actually it's a fraud and that it isn't real, is there a stage where the truth default theory just has to disappear? Or is there a part of the human that still believes that it is all real? So my question, I guess, is does the truth default theory instantly go, or is it a sliding sort of scale of it gradually disappearing?
You sort of gradually lose all hope.
Yeah.
I strongly suspect one size does not fit all. Sometimes let me invoke two of my favorite academic works. The famed sociologist Irving Goffman, who one of his most underappreciated works is Cooling Out the Mark, which is it begins as talking about cons and how once the con is revealed, you don't want the victims to go to the police. In Goffman's word, you don't want them to squawk. So what you got to do is you got to have a cooler who, because it's incredibly esteem threatening to think that you got, nobody wants to be the gullible person who got conned, who got suckered. And in our society, this is embarrassing. This is shameful to be, blame the victim sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So people have real psychological stakes in not recognizing their victimhood. So there's things that the fraudsters can do and that they do. And then Goffman just uses this as a metaphor to explain all kinds of situations that are potentially difficult communication situations. So like me giving a student a bad grade and how I need to cool them out so they don't file a grade dispute, or when you have to fire somebody, or when you break up with somebody. But the other thing that comes to mind is the really famous psychologist Leon Festinger, who came up with dissonance theory. And one of my favorite studies of his, he and his graduate students infiltrated a doomsday cult that was predicting the end of the world, under the assumption that the world really wasn't going to end back in the 50s. And the book's called When Prophecy Fails. And, here, if you view, the cult as a fraud, and it's completely unclear whether these people are just crazy, and crazy and truly believe in it, or if they're just kind of, they know this isn't. But once the prophecy fails and it becomes absolutely unequivocal that the prophecy was false, what happens? And some people, of course, go, oh, this is BS, I'm out of here. But what happens, and this has happened throughout history in doomsday cults, is a substantial number of people double down and increase proselytizing. And rather than admit that they were wrong in their prophecy, they go and seek new members to get more social support to support their misbelief.
It's really interesting. There's, I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thinking about once the fraud is found out, not wanting somebody to call them out on it, there's a common thing that happens in romance fraud, and you'll probably both know this. There's a point when two people have been having a relationship, one of them is the fraudster, one of them isn't, and something happens whereby the victim finds out that the fraudster isn't who they say they are. So they call this person out on it. Claire, you'll know this because there's an example in the book. And the fraudster then messages that person and says, gosh, do you know what? You're absolutely right. You've caught me. And I've been doing this. I've been taking money from you. I'm so sorry. However, This is who I truly am. And while I've been conning you, I've also fallen in love with you as myself. And then the fraud starts again, because the victim might think, oh, okay, well, it's not who they said they were, but it is still the same person that I was speaking to. They've still made me feel the same way. Maybe it can work. They obviously really care about me because they told me this big secret, and the relationship carries on, and then they ask for money under a different guise. So I don't know whether I'm missing it or whether that's kind of similar to what you were talking about, but it seems like a interesting parallel.
Yeah, absolutely. People they're with the relational fraudster for a reason, right? They really want the relationship to work. So they're throwing them a lifeline.
Yeah, so in that example, it almost seems like the truth to fault theory stops, but then just as it's about to stop completely, it then starts again.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh, it's tiring, isn't it?
Yeah, do you know, there's been so many times writing the book where I've just wanted to just put my head on my keyboard and just give up, because some of the stories are so awful, and you just think, I'm not sure how much more I can write about something that's so revolting. It's vile. It's vile.
Tim, you also mentioned about victim blaming, and I know that that's something you focus heavily on in the book, Becky. Can you talk more about that?
Okay, I'll go. So with fraud, there's this language thing, and I was pleased to see on one of the first Fraudible episodes, Steve Goddard talks about the language around fraud. There's this thing we have where we talk about people falling for fraud. Now, we don't use that phrase with any other type of crime. Nobody falls for an assault. Nobody falls for a burglary. One thing I said in the book was, if I go up to somebody in the street and I punch them and I say, oh, fell for that, didn't you? Nobody would accept that. But this language that we use around fraud, particularly romance fraud, it somehow makes it less of a crime, because it's phrased as if somebody just walks into it. It's not something that they've become a victim of. It's something that they have willingly got themselves involved in. And what a stupid person. So the victim blaming in fraud is outrageous. And I think romance fraud in particular, and particularly women, unfortunately, because I think there is this tendency to think, oh, that's the woman's crime. You've got investment fraud and pension fraud and all these kind of things. They're quite manly crimes. I was involved in pension fraud. But romance fraud, oh, that's the girl's one. She can't help it because she wanted a man. So there is still this view of that. And I've written for some national press recently, and when the articles have gone up, predictably, the people who have commented underneath have all said, well, what did she think was going to happen? What a silly cow. She doesn't deserve her money back. She deserves all of this. It's astonishing that as humans, we take so much pleasure in somebody being defrauded out of not only their money, but what they thought was their future partner as well. I mean, how have we come to this point as a human race? It's absolutely awful. And I would love to think that at some point we'll stop that and we'll start thinking of people as victims of a crime, not just some, wally that walked into it. If I could, find a way to do it like that, then of course we all would. But I mean, I'm interested now. Sorry, Claire, I'm now going to ask a question as well.
Go for it.
I'm interested, Tim, to know how the truth default theory relates to victims. Is there, in terms of the language that's used, is there any correlation?
I'm not sure. I don't have a I don't have a good answer. I think generally deception research is pretty clear. People think that they're way better at spotting lies than they really are. People think that they are more suspicious than they really are. And I think what's probably going on psychologically is this kind of desire for kind of superiority. You know, oh, you fool, right? I would never fall for this. Not realizing that, you know, we probably all get fooled somewhat regularly and just never know it. Because this is one thing we don't generally. Fraud's different because at some point I think the fraud comes out usually, right? And some last longer than others, but at some point the truth gets known. But in a lot of in other types of fraud, sometimes it's never discovered, and we never know how many times we've been misled by something because it just never comes out. And if we have a stake in not being fooled, then our kind of psychological defense mechanisms work in favor of the deceiver.
So then could one argue then that if truth default theory didn't exist, then we wouldn't have victim blaming? Because I think that the first sort of assumption of victim blaming is that they shouldn't have fallen for, you know, in inverted commas, for this fraud. And so could one argue that if we weren't so quick to trust someone, that victim blaming just wouldn't be a thing? It wouldn't be a concept?
Maybe the other way around. Once you understand truth default, you don't victim blame because you understand this is deeply human nature. And it's the trouble is people don't understand the truth default. And people have all these folk myths that are counter to this, that leads to this. I think that's how I would frame the argument.
Yeah. Becky and I both went, ooh, at the same time. It was a lovely moment. But yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, it's funny. It takes a while to get your head around it. I know after we spoke, I said to my best friend, oh, I spoke to this man today, and he said this. And my friend went, well, that's rubbish. I don't believe anything that anyone says to me. And I said, well, and then I sort of reeled off like 100 conversations that we'd had over the past week. And he went, oh, yeah. And then he went, are you lying to me now? You do then start to think about things in a very different way.
Yeah. Interesting.
But, you know, it's funny. I'm somebody who, I remember saying when we first started speaking that I'm naturally quite cynical. I always say that to people, and yet I think reality and past experience would show me that actually probably I'm not, because I've been fooled into things way more than anyone else I know. And I think maybe the fact that I think I'm cynical, I sort of wear this as kind of a badge of honor, but actually I'm not at all. I keep getting roped into things. I think it's worked against me.
So do we then try to push the idea of truth default theory out there? Is this something, Tim, that your research is aiming to achieve? Is it something that you're trying to sort of make known in the public eye?
Oh, absolutely. If my academic work never gets beyond, a few classrooms. That knowledge needs to be shared, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're in my book, Tim.
Yeah. There we go.
Thank you. So I'm trying to, that's part of the reason, I do public speaking engagements, and I come onto podcasts and trying to reach audiences outside of universities and outside of people with PhDs.
Yeah. So if we can spread the word about truth to fault theory, then people won't victim blame, and then we can get rid of that. That'll be great. Any other societal changes, Becky, that we want to make on this podcast?
No, I think that's it. We've solved that.
Cool.
Done.
Easy.
Next
Thanks for listening, guys. Sorted. Becky, can you tell me more about like how your experiences with talking to fraudsters sort of helped your understanding about truth to fault theory? Because obviously at the start of this process you didn't know what it was, but you were engaging with these fraudsters using the most hilarious messages I've ever seen in my life. But since you found out about truth to fault theory, how has that changed the way you engage with people online?
I don't think it's changed the way that I engage. I think it's made me understand it more. And also it's made me realise that the fraudsters are susceptible to it as well. So if somebody, I've had fraudsters where they've said to me, where do you live? And I've come up with some horrible name, which is normally too rude to put on this podcast. And I've made up a name of somewhere that I live, and I've said, and they've come back and said, oh, really? That sounds nice. Well, they believe me. They believe me immediately. So even though they're out to deceive, there is still that part of them as a human being that takes what you're saying as read. So the sort of the balance of it, the psychology is quite interesting when you're both actually lying to each other. And obviously they're doing it for money, I'm doing it for entertainment. I think that the truth to fault theory can be applied to basically any interaction with any other person. And, you were talking about different species, Tim. I think the exception to that is cats, because cats seem to hate each other and everybody. So I think they'd be quite happy to not trust or anything. And cat society would be fine without any truth to fault.
Wonderful. So one last question for the two of you then. So Becky, what can authors, what can practitioners learn from those in the academic space about fraud?
I think there is a tendency, and I was guilty of this, to think that if you read an academic paper, it's going to be very dry and it's not going to be relevant to people outside of academia. Having spoken to Tim, a couple of other people, Dr. Elizabeth Carter, it's been fascinating to see just how relevant it is. And I think we can learn an absolute ton. It might be that we need someone to translate from the very clever language. But I think in terms of what practitioners can learn from academics, well, I think it's endless. The academics are people who are being paid to study a subject 24/7, which is something that practitioners don't have the time to do. So you need to work together, absolutely, and equally vice versa.
Yeah. Tim, what can academics learn from practitioners in the fraud space?
not just in the fraud space. But before that, I personally, as an academic, think that most academic research is incredibly boring. Completely uninteresting. like everything, right? You got to find those hidden gems.
It's a fair point. Yeah, definitely.
Academics need to get over themselves and and stop trying to fit academic conventions and trying to be a little bit more interesting. Some do a good job on it, but a lot of it's just like painfully boring. But I think the best way to do that is to get inspiration from outside of academics. This would include from practitioners. One of my favorite academic researchers is a persuasion guy named Bob Cialdini. And he does what he calls full cycle psychology. He studies persuasion. So he gets jobs selling used cars, and he goes around and he learns what's going on. And then he tries to come up with the principles.
Right.
He thinks. And then he takes it in the lab and tries to test the principles to show that they're actually working. And then he goes back and applies them into applied persuasion. He calls this full cycle, right? So you start by observing real life things that you find puzzling. You try to figure out what's going on. You have a tentative thing, then you do some research to try to find some evidence for or against.
Yep.
And then if you find four, then you reapply. And so I think that not always, but very often the best academic research is inspired. One of my most successful lie detection studies was because I was talking to a practitioner, a guy who did training for interrogators at one of the U.S. three-letter secret agencies. And he was in this deception experiment and was telling me what was wrong with this experiment and why this experiment was really not getting at what's really going on. So I took his conversation, applied it in the experiment, found something totally different than the other researcher had, and some of the best results I've ever gotten, and immediately prompted pushback from academics who were like, no. It can't be that the practitioners know something that the academics don't. So I think I tend to see, there's the academics are, if you're a good experimentalist, you can take ideas and then you can test them.
Yeah.
But where you get your ideas from is really the important thing. And a lot of the interesting ideas don't come from me sitting in my chair thinking, what does Tim Levine think is cool? It's from out talking to people and experiencing the world.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. I'd like to thank Professor Tim Levine and Becky Holmes for joining me and today to talk about the truth about fraud, specifically relating to truth to fault theory. So thank you very much, guys. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.